While a few of Eddie Murphy's movies are pretty awful, some of his films get a bad rap and deserve a second chance. Murphy is a star who needs little introduction, and the comic icon is still one of the most popular funnymen nearly 50 years into his career. Helping to anchor Saturday Night Live through one of its lowest periods, Murphy soon branched out into film work, and was an immediate success. 48 Hours rocketed him into superstardom, and he would spend the rest of the 1980s making one hit after another. Action comedies became his specialty, with Beverly Hills Cop remaining an integral part of his legacy. Though he soared to new heights in the 90s and noughties, it hasn't always been perfect. Between hits, Murphy has released plenty of forgotten movies. While some have been forgotten for good reason, others are not nearly as bad as critics said. With Eddie Murphy back in the spotlight, it's high time some of his movies got a second chance. 10. Vampire in Brooklyn, 1995. Eddie Murphy bares his fangs in a scene from Vampire in Brooklyn. A collaboration between Eddie Murphy and Wes Craven never seemed possible, but Vampire in Brooklyn brought together a horror master and a comedy icon. Sadly, the horror comedy is a poor mix of its two genres, but it wasn't a total loss. Murphy is a convincing bloodsucker, even if he isn't very funny as he stalks the New York borough. Craven was a deft director no matter what he was working with, and Vampire in Brooklyn looks great compared to other mid-90s horror films. The makeup is downright chilling, and it at least tries to do something clever with the established vampire mythos. Fans might have wanted a funnier Eddie Murphy, but they got to see his darker side. 9. Harlem Nights, 1989. Quick in Harlem Nights. So far, Harlem Nights is the only film that Eddie Murphy has ever directed, and he pulled double duty in the crime comedy. Teaming Murphy with Richard Pryor, the period piece is set in the late 1930s, and has all the hallmarks of a gangster story. It features an iconic cast of black stars, and should have been great. Unfortunately, Harlem Nights is missing something to really put it over the top. It has flashes of brilliance, but can't sustain itself across the entire running time. Pryor and Murphy work well together, and it's a treat seeing them in the same film. It's worth watching, but is ultimately a missed opportunity. 8. The Distinguished Gentleman, 1992. Cheryl Lee Ralph in The Distinguished Gentleman. The Distinguished Gentleman is an Eddie Murphy movie that slipped through the cracks, and isn't really talked about much at all. While some of Murphy's films are despised for their low quality, all the 1992 flop usually gets is a mild shrug. It's a political comedy where Murphy is perfectly cast, but it isn't particularly ambitious with its messaging. Box Office Mojo notes that The Distinguished Gentleman earned $86 million against a $50 million budget, but it likely lost money when factoring in additional costs. The studio clearly thought Murphy's star power would be enough, so The Distinguished Gentleman mostly coasts along on a few gags. Nevertheless, Murphy brings an energy to the lackluster script, and he elevates what could have been an absolute disaster. It deserves a second chance because, while it isn't great, it's better than its 13% score on Rotten Tomatoes. 7. Mr. Church, 2016. Eddie Murphy stands in a kitchen with his hand on his hip in Mr. Church. Returning for the first time in 4 years, Eddie Murphy made a dramatic step out onto the stage as the title character in Mr. Church. The somewhat overly sentimental drama was based on a true story, but is still guilty of falling into overused tropes. Murphy's performance is the highlight, and for that the movie is worth a watch. Instead of trying to go with something off the wall, Murphy's dramatic turn is subtle and still allows a lot of his natural charisma to shine through. Mr. Church is a brisk little movie that never overstays its welcome, and there are certainly worse films in Murphy's catalogue. 6. The Haunted Mansion, 2003. Eddie Murphy in The Haunted Mansion. While it may hold a nostalgic place in many hearts, The Haunted Mansion was not well regarded when it first came out. Based on the attraction at Disney theme parks, the horror comedy was forced to try to compete with the wildly popular Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, which premiered a few months earlier. Murphy is actually quite funny as the scaredy-cat real estate agent, Jim Evers, and the film crafts an interesting story out of the ride's thin narrative. It mostly suffers from tone issues, with the humor being far too juvenile for its own good. However, when compared to the cynical and algorithmic 2023 Haunted Mansion movie, the original is much better. 5. Another 48 Hours, 1990. Another 48 Hours. 48 Hours was Eddie Murphy's film debut, but by the time he returned for the sequel, he was already a superstar. The buddy cop comedy came nearly a decade later, and Another 48 Hours was not nearly as beloved as its predecessor. Nick Nolte returned to co-star, but there was clearly something missing that kept it from being truly great. The biggest issue with Another 48 Hours is that its plot is too contrived. The ticking clock framework was excellent in the first movie, but the sequel had to bend over backward to think of a new 48-hour scenario. Nevertheless, Murphy and Nolte slide back into their roles effortlessly, and it's a fun little addition to the buddy cop genre. 4. Beverly Hills Cop 3, 1994. Timothy Carhart as DeWalt and Eddie Murphy as Axel fake smiling in Beverly Hills Cop 3. Already a decade into the franchise, Beverly Hills Cop 3 got poor reviews but was a decent box office success. Murphy once again dons his Letterman jacket and heads back to Beverly Hills, and director John Landis tapped in for Tony Scott, who departed the series after directing the second film. All the pieces were there, but they just didn't fit together. Murphy is strong as Axel Foley, and the rest of the ensemble returned too, but the repetitiveness became apparent. The action got more bombastic, which is quite fun to watch, but it's not as funny as its predecessors. However, Beverly Hills Cop 3 is still an enjoyable movie, and the franchise as a whole is worth binge-watching. 3. Holy Man, 1998. Eddie Murphy in Holy Man. In the middle of his run of family-friendly hits, Eddie Murphy starred in the baffling comedy, Holy Man. Murphy stars as a self-help guru who uses a home shopping channel to spread his message. It was an interesting change of pace for Murphy, but nobody was biting. Critics hated it, and it was a box office disaster of epic proportions. Despite that poor setup, Holy Man is certainly worth revisiting, mainly because of how strange it is. Murphy gives an earnest performance, and the movie is clearly trying to say something about happiness and consumerism. However, its message is quite muddled, and the fun comes from trying to decipher the larger moral statement behind the film Boomerang, 1992. Eddie Murphy in Boomerang. Of all the Eddie Murphy movies worth a revisit, Boomerang comes the closest to being one of his truly great films. The romantic comedy drudges up age-old battle of the sexes plot points, but Murphy and his co-stars are so enjoyable that its originality really doesn't matter all that much.